The morning Whitaker and Opaline Mercer were thrown out of Brantley Hollis's ranch house. The temperature had already dropped below freezing, and neither child owned a coat. They stood in the hard-packed dirt of the yard with nothing but flour sack clothes and a single canvas bag between them. Whit was 18 years old. His sister Opal was 13. The man who was supposed to be their guardian had just told them they were worthless. "Two useless mouths," Brantley Hollis said, spitting tobacco juice onto his own kitchen floor. "The boy only knows how to read books. The girl only knows how to cook strange food. Your daddy owed me money and I took you both on to settle the debt. But you ain't worth the scraps I put in your bellies. Get out." It was November of 1934 in the high ridge country of eastern Kentucky, and the Great Depression had turned even kind people hard. But Brantley Hollis had never been kind. He was the biggest cattle rancher in Copper Creek, a man who owned 3,000 acres and the loyalty or the fear of everyone in the valley. When he said a thing, people accepted it as fact. And what he had said about the Mercer children, he had been saying since the day they arrived 2 years earlier. That they were strange, that they were lazy, that the boy spent too much time reading and asking questions, that the girls spent too much time cooking food that nobody asked for. The truth was something different entirely. Their father, Thomas Mercer, had been a school teacher and a self-taught naturalist who filled their small cabin with books about botany, geology, and the science of cooking. Their mother, Eleanor, had been the finest cook in 3 counties, a woman who understood that food was chemistry, that bread was a living thing, that a proper stock required patience and understanding. Together, they had taught their children everything they knew. By the time Whit was 14, he could explain why certain herbs preserved meat, why salt drew moisture from vegetables, and why the temperature of water mattered when making bread. By the time Opal was 10, she could identify 40 species of wild mushroom, bake sourdough from a starter she had kept alive for 2 years, and explain why vinegar made pie crust flaky. They were a family built on knowledge and love, and the belief that understanding the world made you better able to live in it. Then the typhoid came through the valley in the autumn of 1932. It took Thomas and Eleanor within a week of each other. Whit was 16, Opal was 11. They buried their parents in the small cemetery behind the Methodist church, and they stood there holding hands while the preacher said words that meant nothing to either of them. The children had been placed with Brantley Hollis because he was the only person in Copper Creek willing to take on 2 extra mouths to feed, and only because Thomas had owed him $18 for a load of fence posts, or so Hollis claimed. He saw the children as unpaid labor, nothing more. For 2 years, Whit worked the cattle from dawn until dark. He mended fences in the freezing rain. He hauled water until his shoulders ached. He split wood until his hands bled and calloused over and bled again. Opal scrubbed floors. She washed clothes in water so cold it turned her fingers blue. She cooked meals for Hollis and his wife Dorothea and the ranch hands. Simple plain food because Hollis did not tolerate what he called fanciness. When Opal once tried to season a stew with wild thyme and garlic she had gathered from the hillside, Hollis dumped the pot on the ground and told her she was putting on airs. "Your mama thought she was better than everybody too," he said. "Look where that got her." Opal did not cry. She had learned not to cry in front of Brantley Hollis. But that night, lying in the small, cold room she shared with her brother, she whispered to Whit that she missed their mother so much it felt like a hole in her chest that would never heal. Whit held her hand in the darkness. "Mama taught us how to survive," he said. "They can take everything else, but they can't take that." But the real trouble started when Opal tried to feed others. There were families in Copper Creek who were starving. Children with swollen bellies and hollow eyes. The Depression had taken everything from people who had little to begin with, and now they were watching their children grow weak and thin. Opal began slipping food from Hollis's kitchen. Small things, scraps he would never miss, a handful of cornmeal here, a few potatoes there. She would wrap them in cloth and leave them on doorsteps before dawn when no one could see. She also began foraging in the woods the way her father had taught her, gathering what grew wild on the mountainside. Ramps and pawpaws and hickory nuts and Jerusalem artichokes. She would make simple meals from these ingredients and give them to anyone who was hungry. It was not much, but it was something. Whit helped when he could. He carried the parcels, he kept watch. He never told his sister to stop because he understood what she was doing and why. They were keeping their mother alive the only way they knew how. Hollis found out not because he noticed the missing food, but because someone told him. Lavinia Pickett ran the dry goods store in Copper Creek. She was a woman who kept track of everyone's business and made sure everyone knew she was keeping track. She had a tongue sharp as a razor and a memory that held grudges the way a steel trap held rabbits. When she heard people saying nice things about the Mercer girls' cooking, she mentioned it to Brantley Hollis the very next day. "Folks are talking about that girl of yours," Lavinia said, "saying she's got a gift, saying her food tastes like something special." That rubbed Hollis the wrong way. He did not want anyone in his household earning praise he had not authorized. He did not want people thinking those children were anything other than what he said they were: worthless, burdensome. Charity cases he had taken on out of the goodness of his heart. So he threw them out, and to make sure nobody took them in, he told everyone in town that they had been stealing from him. Not just scraps, but money and silver. He said the boy had taken coins from his dresser. He said the girl had stolen a silver serving spoon that had belonged to his grandmother. It was not true. None of it was true. But Brantley Hollis's word was law in Copper Creek. And when he said a thing, people believed it. "Anyone who takes them in is taking my enemies into their home," Hollis announced at the general store, his voice carrying to every corner. "And my enemies are their enemies too." Dorothea Hollis stood behind her husband, saying nothing. She had watched the children work for 2 years. She had eaten the food Opal cooked. She knew the accusations were lies, but she said nothing. So Whit and Opal stood in the frozen yard with nowhere to go and no one willing to help them. Opal looked up at her brother. Her lips were already turning blue from the cold. "What do we do?" she asked. Whit looked north toward the mountains. The Blue Ridge rose steep and wild against the gray November sky. Nobody much bothered to go up there. The terrain was too rough. The winters were too harsh. There was nothing up there but rocks and trees and silence. "We walk," Whit said. He took his sister's hand, and they walked. They walked for most of that first day. Whit led the way, following deer trails through stands of bare oak and hickory. They climbed higher as the air grew thinner and colder. By afternoon, Opal's feet were bleeding through the newspaper stuffed in her two big boots, and she was shaking so hard she could barely hold the canvas bag. The bag held everything they owned in the world. 2 books that had belonged to their theater, one about botany and one about the science of food preservation. A paring knife that had been their mother's favorite. A tin cup. And a photograph of their parents on their wedding day, the edges worn soft from being held. They had nothing else. As the sun began to set, painting the bare trees gold and crimson, a dog appeared on the trail ahead of them. It was a hound mix, lean and scruffy, with fur the color of old pennies. It watched them approach with cautious eyes, its tail tucked low. Ribs showed through its coat. It was as hungry as they were, as lost as they were, as alone as they were. When Opal knelt down and held out her hand, the dog came forward slowly and sniffed her fingers. "He's hungry," Opal said. "So are we, why," Whit replied. But Opal dug into the canvas bag and pulled out a small piece of dried corn cake she had managed to save. She broke it in half and gave half to the dog. The dog ate it in one gulp. Then it looked at her with eyes that seemed to understand something words could never express. "I'm going to call him Copper," Opal said, "because of his fur." Whit did not argue. He was too tired. And there was something comforting about having another living thing with them in the vast silence of the mountains. Something that made the emptiness feel a little less empty. That night, they found a shallow overhang of rock that provided some shelter from the wind. They huddled together with Copper pressed between them, sharing what little warmth they had. The temperature dropped below zero. Opal could not stop shaking. Her teeth chattered so hard that Whit was afraid she would bite through her tongue. He wrapped his arms around her and pulled her close, and Copper pressed against her back, and together they made a small pocket of warmth in the freezing darkness. "Are we going to die here?" Opal whispered. Whit did not answer for a long moment. He was thinking about their father, who had taught him that knowledge was the difference between survival and death. He was thinking about their mother, who had taught Opal that food was not just sustenance, but medicine, comfort, and love. "No," he finally said. "Mama taught us how to survive. We just have to remember what she taught us." Opal was quiet for a while. Her shaking had begun to slow as the shared warmth took hold. Then she said, I dreamed about her last night, before Hollis threw us out. She was standing in a kitchen I didn't recognize. It was made of stone, and there was a fire burning, and she was making bread. She looked at me and smiled, and she said, "You found your kitchen, Opal. Now build it." Whit held his sister tighter. "Then that's what we'll do," he said. "We'll build it." They survived the night. In the morning, Copper led them to water, a small creek that ran clear and cold over smooth stones. They drank deeply and filled their tin cup to carry with them. They walked for another half day, climbing higher into the mountains. The air was thin and sharp. The trees grew sparser. The wind cut through their thin clothes like knives. And then Copper began to bark. The dog ran ahead, disappearing behind a curtain of dead Virginia creeper that hung across a rocky outcrop. Whit and Opal followed, pushing through the dry vines, their hearts pounding. Behind them was a cave. The opening was about 12 feet wide and 8 feet tall. The rock above it jutted out like a shelf, creating a natural overhang that kept rain and snow away from the entrance. Whit stepped inside and felt the air change immediately. It was warmer. Not warm like a house, but warmer than outside by a considerable margin. The cave went back about 60 feet, narrowing gradually before opening into a second, smaller chamber. The floor was dry, packed earth. The walls were smooth limestone, pale as cream. Whit stood very still, remembering something from his father's books. "Caves maintain a constant temperature," he said slowly, his voice echoing slightly off the stone. "About 55 degrees year-round. The earth itself acts as insulation. In winter, 55 degrees feels warm. In summer, it feels cool." Opal stepped past him, looking around the space with different eyes. She was not seeing a cave. She was seeing something else. Something that had existed first in her mother's kitchen, and then in her dreams. "A good kitchen needs 3 things," she said softly, reciting words their mother had told her years ago. "A reliable heat source, clean water, and storage." She pointed to the back of the cave. "The second chamber stays cool all the time. That's storage. The creek is close. That's water." She turned to look at the entrance where pale winter light filtered in. "And if we build a fire in the right place, the stone walls will hold the heat." Whit understood what she was saying. Their mother had taught Opal how to cook. Their father had taught Whit why things worked the way they did. Apart, they each had half the knowledge they needed. Together, they had everything. "We're not just going to survive," Whit said. "We're going to build something." Opal nodded. Her eyes were bright despite the exhaustion, despite the hunger, despite everything they had lost and everything they still had to face. "We're going to build Mama's kitchen," she said. Copper walked in circles near the entrance, then lay down with a satisfied sigh, as if he had known all along that this was where they were supposed to be. "Now I want you to consider something. 2 children thrown out into the snow with nothing but 2 books, a knife, and a dog. The temperature below zero. The nearest help miles away. Everyone who might have taken them in has been warned not to. Do you think they can survive this winter? Do you think they can build something from nothing? Think about what you would do in their place. Think about whether you would have the courage to try, the knowledge to succeed. Leave your thoughts in the comments below and then keep listening." The first 2 weeks were the hardest of their lives. They survived on what they could find. The last of the fall's hickory nuts, which they cracked open with rocks until their fingers were raw. Dried persimmons still clinging to their branches, wrinkled and sweet. Watercress growing along the creek, bitter but nutritious. Whit nearly died twice. The first time was a fall on an icy slope that left him with a deep gash on his thigh. Blood soaked through his trousers and dripped onto the snow, leaving a trail that any predator could follow. Opal had to half carry him back to the cave, her thin arms straining under his weight. She packed the wound with sphagnum moss the way their father's book described. She sat up all night watching him for signs of fever, feeding the fire stick by stick, praying to a god she was not sure she believed in anymore. The second time was when he drank water downstream from a place where something had died. The stomach cramps were so severe he could not move for 2 days. He lay on the cold cave floor, shaking and sweating, while Opal fed him small sips of clean water and sang the songs their mother used to sing. "Hush, little baby, don't say a word," she sang, her voice cracking. Mama's gonna buy you a mockingbird. She was 13 years old. She was keeping her brother alive with nothing but willpower and love. Opal nearly died once. She went out foraging in what seemed like mild weather and got caught in a sudden storm. The temperature plunged so fast that by the time she made it back to the cave, her fingers and toes were white and numb. Frostbite. The kind that could cost you fingers. The kind that could kill. Whit rubbed her hands between his own for hours, generating friction, generating warmth. Copper lay across her feet, his body heat slowly thawing the frozen flesh. And slowly, painfully, the color came back into her skin. But they did not give up. Something inside them, the same thing that had made them read their father's books by candlelight, the same thing that had made them forage in the woods to feed their neighbors, the same thing that Brantley Hollis had called worthlessness and stubbornness, refused to let them lie down and quit. On the worst nights, when the wind howled outside and the cold crept in despite the fire, Opal talked to herself, or rather she talked to her mother. She would describe what she was going to make when she got her hands on proper ingredients, the way a shipwrecked sailor might describe the house he would build when he reached shore. She would talk about bread with a golden crust and a soft center, about soup thick with vegetables and fragrant with herbs, about pie with a flaky crust and filling sweet enough to make you close your eyes and remember what happiness felt like. It kept her sane. It kept her thinking forward instead of backward. And she began to study the cave. This was where Opal's strange education, the one Hollis had mocked, the one Copper Creek had dismissed as impractical, became the most practical knowledge in the world. She noticed that the cave's second chamber had a natural chimney, a crack in the ceiling that drew air upward. She realized that if they built a fire in the right spot, the smoke would vent naturally while the heat would radiate off the limestone walls and stay trapped inside the chamber. Whit recognized what she was describing from their father's books. Thermal mass, he said. It's the same principle that makes old stone churches cool in summer and warm in winter. The stone absorbs heat during the day and releases it slowly at night. Within a month, they had built a fire pit lined with river rocks that Whit carried up from the creek one by one. They had constructed a sleeping platform of woven branches, raised off the cold ground where the chill collected. They had made a crude but functional door for the cave entrance, from saplings lashed together with bark strips and covered with layers of pine boughs. But it was the cooking that saved them. Opal built her kitchen the way their mother had described, piece by piece, stone by stone. Using flat rocks from the creek bed, she constructed a cooking surface beside the fire pit, a broad level shelf where she could prepare food. She did not have pots at first, so she made them. Her father's books described how the Cherokee crafted cooking vessels from soapstone, a soft carvable rock that could withstand direct heat. Whit found a deposit of the stone about a mile from the cave, and together they spent days chipping and scraping until they had two rough but functional pots and a broad flat cooking stone. Opal fashioned a cutting board from a slab of poplar sanded smooth with creek grit. She wove baskets from white oak splits to hold her foraged ingredients. She built a drying rack from green hickory poles where she hung strips of venison from a deer Whit managed to snare, and bundles of wild herbs she gathered from the mountainside. Every improvement was small, but together they added up to something that looked unmistakably like a kitchen. Rough and primitive, but functional and clean and organized, with a logic that their mother would have recognized. Opal made her first real meal in the cave kitchen on a December evening when the snow lay thick on the ground and the stars burned cold and bright above the mountains. It was a soup of dried mushrooms, wild onions, hickory nuts, and rabbit soy from a snare their father had taught them to build. She cooked it slowly over the fire, adjusting the heat the way her mother had taught her, tasting and adjusting until the flavors balanced. She served it in the soapstone pot, and she and Whit ate sitting on their sleeping platform with Copper lying at their feet. Opal cried as she ate, not because she was siti, though sadness was there too, a constant companion that never quite left. She cried because the soup tasted like something her mother might have made. She cried because she had made it entirely by herself in a place no one knew existed. She cried because they were alive when so many forces had conspired to make them dead. Whit put his arm around her shoulders and said nothing. Some moments are too big for words. The turning point came in January when they met Ezekiel Bowen. Ezekiel, who everyone called Zeke, was a 70-year-old former steamboat cook who lived alone in a one-room cabin about 2 miles from the cave. He had come to the mountains 30 years earlier after a lifetime of cooking in the galleys of paddle wheelers on the Mississippi River. He had fed gamblers and cotton merchants and river captains. He had cooked for governors and their wives. He had seen the best and worst of human nature from behind a stove. And then he had grown tired of people and had come to the mountains to be alone. He was also one of the finest natural cooks Opal would ever encounter. A man who could make a feast out of practically nothing. A man who understood food not just as sustenance, but as craft, as art, as a way of caring for people, even when they did not deserve to be cared for. Zeke found them because he noticed someone had been harvesting watercress from his creek. He was not angry about it. He was curious. In 30 years, no one had bothered to venture this far up the mountain. So he followed the tracks through the snow, moving quietly the way a man learns to move when he has spent decades reading the rhythms of rivers and forests. The tracks led to a cave. Inside the cave, he found two half-starved children and a copper-colored dog. There was a soapstone pot on the fire with mushroom broth bubbling inside. There was a kitchen setup that made him stop and stare. He stood in the cave entrance with a walking stick in one hand and a battered tin lantern in the other. "Well," he said, "either I've gone crazy or there's children living in this hole." "We're not children," Whit said, standing up and positioning himself between the old man and his sister. His hand went to the paring knife at his belt. "I'm 18. She's 13. Zeke studied him for a moment. He saw the protective stance, the wary eyes, the fierce love that would fight to the death if necessary. He had seen that look before in the eyes of mothers protecting their young, in the eyes of soldiers protecting their brothers. Then he looked past Whit at Opal, who was stirring the pot with a wooden spoon she had carved herself. Then he looked at the fire pit, the cooking stone, the filtered water system made from hollow logs packed with charcoal and sand. He leaned down and sniffed the broth. "Who taught you to cook?" he asked. "My mother," Opal said, "and my father's books." Zeke was quiet for a long time. He walked slowly around the cave, examining everything. The drying rack with its strips of venison, the storage area in the back chamber, the sleeping platform raised off the cold ground, the door made of saplings and pine boughs. Finally, he sat down on a rock near the fire. "I've been cooking for 55 years, he said. "I've cooked on steamboats and in restaurants and in rich people's houses. I've fed more people than I can count." He looked at Opal with something in his eyes that might have been respect or might have been wonder. "I've never met anybody who could make a kitchen out of a cave." He paused. "Your parents must have been remarkable people." "They were," Opal said. "What were their names?" "Thomas and Eleanor Mercer." Zeke went very still. The firelight flickered across his weathered face, and something shifted in his expression. Something that looked like recognition. Something that looked like pain. "Thomas Mercer," he repeated slowly. "The school teacher? Lived in the cabin down by Miller's Creek?" Whit nodded, surprised. "You knew our father?" Zeke did not answer immediately. He seemed to be looking at something far away, something that existed only in memory. His hands, gnarled with age and work, gripped his walking stick tightly. "Your daddy helped me when I first came to these mountains," he finally said. 30 years ago. I couldn't read or write worth a damn. Spent my whole life on rivers. Never had time for schooling. Never had anyone who cared enough to teach me." He looked up at the ceiling of the cave, blinking rapidly. "Thomas Mercer taught me to write my own name. Taught me to read well enough to follow a recipe book. Never charged me a cent. Wouldn't take nothing for it. Just said that knowledge was meant to be shared. And what good was knowing something if you didn't pass it on?" He looked at Whit, then at Opal. "Thomas Mercer was the kindest man I ever met," he said. "I owed him a debt I never got to repay." He stood up slowly, his old joints creaking in the cold. "I reckon I'm repaying it now." Zeke did not try to take them back to town. He did not lecture them or pity them. He did not treat them like children who needed to be saved or problems that needed to be solved. Instead, he did something far more valuable. He treated them like fellow cooks. Over the following weeks, he began visiting the cave regularly. Sometimes he came in the morning, sometimes in the evening, always bringing something they could not find on their own. Salt, which was worth its weight in gold in the mountains. Flour, which Opal measured out as carefully as medicine. A proper cast iron skillet that Zeke claimed he had a spare of, though Opal suspected he had bought it new just for them. In return, Opal shared what she had foraged, and they cooked together. From Zeke, Opal learned things no book could teach. She learned how to smoke meat so it would last through winter, hanging strips of venison in a smokehouse made of stacked stones where smoldering hickory wood would slowly cure the flesh over 3 weeks at a constant 70 degrees. She learned the art of making bread in a cast iron pot buried in coals. Zeke called it hobo bread, a technique he had learned from men who rode the rails during the worst years of the Depression. Men who had nothing but managed to make something warm and nourishing from practically nothing at all. She learned how to render bare fat into lard, how to make vinegar from wild apples fermented in the constant 55-degree temperature of the cave, and how to cure country ham in the cool recesses of the inner chamber. From Wit, Zeke learned things too. The old cook had never understood the science behind cooking the way Wit did. He had always worked by instinct, by feel, by years of trial and error. But Wit could explain why salt drew moisture from meat, why acid brightened flavors, why certain herbs complemented certain proteins. Opal explained these things with the simple clarity of someone who had been taught to think about food as both art and science. Wit provided the technical understanding, the why behind the how. And Zeke listened with the respect of a man who knew that wisdom could come from anywhere, even from children young enough to be his grandchildren. Together, they expanded the cave kitchen into something extraordinary. That spring, they built a second cooking area near the cave entrance, where sunlight poured in during the morning hours. They constructed a stone oven, a true bread oven, based on designs Opal found in one of her father's books about French country baking. The oven was built from limestone blocks mortared with a mixture of clay and ash. It had a domed ceiling that trapped heat and radiated it evenly. It took 3 weeks to build and another week to cure properly, firing it hotter each day until the clay hardened into something like ceramic. But when Opal pulled the first loaf of sourdough from its interior, golden crusted, perfectly risen, with a crumb so open and tender it seemed impossible that it had been baked in a cave in the Kentucky mountains, Zeke sat down and laughed until he had tears in his eyes. "Girl," he said, wiping his face with his sleeve, "I cooked for governors and riverboat captains. I made bread for people who had everything money could buy, and I never baked anything half as good as this." Opal smiled for the first time since her parents had died. A real smile, a smile that reached her eyes. "Mama would have made it better," she said. "Maybe," Zeke replied, "but she would have been proud. Lord, she would have been proud." They did not stop there. Over that first year, Opal and Wit and Zeke transformed the cave and the land around it into a functioning homestead centered entirely on food. They terraced the hillside below the cave entrance, building stone retaining walls and filling the terraces with rich soil carried up from the creek bottom in baskets. It was back-breaking work. Wit's hands blistered and bled and calloused over. Opal's back ached so badly some nights she could barely sleep. But by summer, the terraces were planted. Herbs and greens and root vegetables. Wild plants she had been gathering, now cultivated and controlled. Ramps and pokeweed and mountain mint and bee balm and dozens of others. She saved seeds from everything she could find, drying them carefully and storing them in the cool interior of the cave where they would keep for years. They built a smokehouse from stacked stone. They built a spring house over a small seep near the cave to keep milk and butter cold. They built drying racks where they preserved mushrooms and herbs and strips of venison and fish from the creek. The cave's inner chamber became an aging room. Its constant temperature and humidity were perfect for curing meats, fermenting sauerkraut, and storing wheels of the simple cheese Opal learned to make from goat's milk after Zeke traded a neighbor for 2 doughs. By the autumn of 1935, less than a year after they had been thrown out with nothing, the cave kitchen was producing more food than 3 people and a dog could eat. And that was when Opal made the decision that would change everything. She started feeding people again. It began small. Zeke knew a few families in the scattered mountain settlements above Copper Creek, people even poorer than the folks in town. families living so far up the hollows that they had been forgotten by everyone, including the government programs that were supposed to help during the Depression. Opal began sending food home with Zeke to distribute. Loaves of bread wrapped in cloth, jars of preserved vegetables sealed with beeswax, smoked fish bundled in bark. She did not ask for anything in return. She did not even ask that people know where the food came from. She just wanted to feed them. Word spread the way it does in mountain communities. Slowly, through a network of trust and whisper, people began talking about the food that appeared on doorsteps, about the bread that tasted like something from another world, about the vegetables preserved so perfectly they might have been picked that morning. By the winter of 1935, people were making the trek up to the cave. They came hesitantly at first, embarrassed to accept charity from two children living in a hole in the rock. But what they found was not charity, it was something else entirely. Opal did not just give people food, she taught them to cook. She began holding what she called kitchen days. Anyone who wanted to come could make the walk up to the cave and spend a day learning. She showed women who had been boiling the same pot of beans their whole lives how to make bread that rose and browned and filled a house with warmth. She taught them how to preserve food safely, how to stretch a single chicken into 3 meals, how to make a nourishing soup from things most people would have thrown away. She taught children to identify edible plants in the forest, turning foraging walks into adventures that left them with full baskets and full minds. She demonstrated how to build a root cellar, how to smoke meat, how to make vinegar and soap and medicine from the plants that grew wild all around them. The cave kitchen became a gathering place, a school, a community center, a place where people who had nothing could come and sit by a fire and eat something warm and good and learn how to feed themselves and their families. On the coldest days of that second winter, Opal sometimes had 20 people crowded into the cave, passing bowls of stew and listening to Zeke tell stories about his riverboat days while she showed a circle of women how to shape bread dough. Whit managed the logistics. He organized the food stores. He tracked what they had and what they needed. He made sure the fire never went out and the water system never failed. Copper moved among the visitors like a gracious host, accepting pats on the head and scraps of food, making children laugh with his patient good nature. And slowly, without anyone quite realizing it was happening, the cave kitchen became the heart of something larger than any of them had imagined. Now here is something worth considering. Brantley Hollis threw 2 children into the snow because people praised the girls' cooking, because he could not stand for anyone in his household to be valued more than he valued them. Do you think he will sit quietly while those same children become beloved by half the county? Do you think a man like that will let his lies go unexposed without a fight? Think about what kind of man he is. Think about what threatens him most. And then keep listening. The news eventually reached Copper Creek. It was Lavinia Pickett, inevitably, who carried the story down the mountain. She had heard from her cousin's wife, who had heard from a neighbor that there were 2 children up in the Blue Ridge who had built a kitchen in a cave and were feeding half the county. Lavinia told Brantley Hollis, expecting him to laugh, expecting him to dismiss it as mountain gossip, the kind of tall tale that grew with every telling. Hollis did not laugh. He went white, because the winter of 1936 had been brutal for him. His cattle had been hit by disease, and he had lost 200 head. 3 of his tenant farmers had abandoned their land, unable to make the payments he demanded. The bank was asking questions about his loans that he did not want to answer, and because people in Copper Creek were hungry. When Hollis heard that the children he had thrown out, the children he had called worthless and useless and thieves, were up in the mountains feeding people for free, he understood immediately what it meant. It meant he had been wrong. And if there was one thing Brantley Hollis could not tolerate, it was being wrong. He tried to put a stop to it. He told people the food was probably poisoned. He said the children were witches who had made a pact with the devil. He said no good Christian should have anything to do with them. Dr. Phineas Ashworth, the town physician, stood up at a meeting and declared that wild food was dangerous and that anyone who ate mushrooms foraged by children was taking their life into their hands. "I've seen what happens when people eat the wrong plants," he announced. "Convulsions, liver failure, death. These children have no training, no credentials. They are a danger to public health." Reverend Josiah Clement preached a sermon about the dangers of pagan practices and old ways that had no place in a Christian community. There are those among us who would lead the faithful astray, he thundered from the pulpit, who would have us return to the superstitions and wickedness of our ancestors. We must resist these temptations with prayer and vigilance. Cleet Tanner, a loudmouth young man who spent most of his time drinking and gambling, rode up to the cave one afternoon with three of his friends. They threw rocks at Copper and shouted insults at Wit and laughed at the stone oven in the terrace gardens. "I'll bet you $5 they're dead by Christmas," Cleet announced to anyone who would listen back in town. "The boy is building graves up there, not kitchens. Just you wait and see." One night, someone crept up to the cave and destroyed the lowest terrace wall, scattering the carefully built stones and tearing up the plants Opal had been nurturing for months. Opal stood in the ruins the next morning, tears streaming down her face. Wit put his hand on her shoulder. "We'll rebuild it," he said. "Why do they hate us so much?" Opal asked. "We're just trying to help. We're not hurting anyone." "They don't hate us," Wit said slowly. He had been thinking about this for a long time, trying to understand the cruelty that seemed to follow them. "They hate being wrong. Hollis told everyone we were worthless, and we're proving him a liar just by existing. Every time someone eats your bread, they're seeing the truth, and some people would rather destroy the truth than admit they believed a lie. They rebuilt the wall, they replanted the terrace, and they kept feeding people, because that was what their mother would have done." Not everyone in Copper Creek followed Hollis's lead. Old Mamie Garrettson was 78 years old, the oldest person in the valley. She remembered things that most people had forgotten: old ways of preserving food, old ways of reading weather, old ways of surviving winters that would kill anyone who relied only on what they could buy in a store. When Mamie heard about the cave kitchen, she made the walk up the mountain herself, leaning on a walking stick carved from hickory. It took her most of a day, and she had to stop and rest every 100 yards toward the end. But she made it. "My grandmother used to make cheese in a cave," she told Opal, looking around the kitchen with eyes that had seen 8 decades of change. "Said the temperature kept it from spoiling. Said it was the old one from before the stores came." She picked up a jar of preserved vegetables and held it up to the light. "Young people think they invented everything," she said. "But the old ways always come back. They come back because they work. They come back because they're true." She traded Opal a handful of heirloom tomato seeds for a loaf of bread, and she told everyone in Copper Creek who would listen that the Mercer children were keeping alive knowledge that most people had forgotten was ever lost. Dr. Phineas Ashworth's daughter Cordelia was 22 years old and bored nearly to death by life in a small mountain town. She had been educated at a finishing school in Lexington. She had read books about the wider world, and she was suffocating in a place where her opinions were never asked for and her intelligence was never valued. When she heard her father ranting about the dangers of folk medicine and primitive cooking, something contrary stirred in her. She made the walk up to the cave without telling anyone. What she found amazed her. The kitchen was cleaner than most kitchens in town. The food storage was more organized than the back room of her father's clinic. The bread Opal served her made Cordelia close her eyes. It was warm and crusty on the outside, soft and alive on the inside. It tasted like something she had been missing her whole life without knowing it. She started coming back, first once a week, then twice, then almost every day. She learned to cook beside Opal. She learned about herbs and preservation and fermentation. She learned about the science behind food from Wit, who explained things in ways that made her see the world differently. And something else began to grow between Cordelia and Wit, something neither of them talked about, but both of them felt. Something that made the air between them feel charged with possibility. Copper seemed to approve. He followed Cordelia around the cave, wagging his tail, leaning against her legs when she sat down. Animals know things about people that people sometimes take years to figure out. By 1936, the cave kitchen had been running for 2 full years. Opal was 15 now, and something had changed in her. She moved with confidence. She made decisions without hesitation. She had become someone her mother would have recognized as a fellow cook, not a student, but an equal. Wit was 20, quieter than ever, but steady as bedrock. He had taken over most of the building and planning, always thinking 3 steps ahead, always making sure they would have what they needed when winter came. Zeke was 72 and slowing down. His joints ached in the cold. He tired more easily than he used to. But he still came to the cave almost every day, still shared his knowledge, still told stories that made people laugh until their sides hurt. The cave kitchen was feeding people from 5 different mountain communities. On kitchen days, Opal sometimes had 30 people learning at once, crowded around the fire, watching her demonstrate techniques that their grandmothers might have known, but their mothers had never learned. Then, in the deep cold of January 1936, Zeke fell sick. It started as a cough, just a cough. But then came the fever. Then something worse, something that made it hard for him to breathe, that left him too weak to get out of bed. Whit ran down the mountain to fetch Dr. Ashworth. The doctor refused to come. "I don't make house calls for people who encourage ignorance," he said, not quite meeting Whit's eyes. "That old man has been filling children's heads with dangerous nonsense for years. Let him take some of his folk medicine and see how well it works." Whit stood in the doctor's parlor, his hands clenched into fists, rage boiling in his chest. He wanted to grab the man and shake him. He wanted to make him understand that Zeke was dying, that none of their disagreements mattered when someone's life hung in the balance. Cordelia appeared in the doorway. She had heard everything. Her face was pale, her jaw set with determination. "I'll come," she said. Her father turned on her. "You will do no such thing." "Then you can explain to Mother why I've moved out," Cordelia said calmly, "because I'm going up that mountain, whether you like it or not." She gathered medical supplies from her father's clinic, knowing where everything was kept, knowing what might help. And she followed Whit up the mountain. For 3 days, they fought to save Zeke's life. Cordelia used what medical knowledge she had learned from her father, the same knowledge he had forbidden her from practicing. Opal made broths and teas from herbs that her father's books said would help with breathing and fever. Whit kept the fire burning and the water boiling and did whatever anyone needed him to do. And Opal ran the kitchen alone. She was 15 years old. She had 23 people depending on her for food. Zeke was dying and Whit was consumed with trying to save him. But people still came to the cave because they were hungry, because they had walked for hours through the snow, because they had children at home who needed to eat. So Opal fed them all. She baked bread. She made soup. She showed women how to prepare the food they would take home to their families. She answered questions and solved problems and never once let anyone see how frightened she was. On the 3rd night, Zeke's fever broke. He was weak and would remain weak for weeks, but he was going to live. When Opal finally sat down by the fire that night, exhaustion hitting her all at once like a wave, Whit sat down beside her. "You did it," he said. "You kept everything going by yourself." Opal shook her head. "I just did what Mama would have done." "That's what I mean," Whit said. They sat together in silence, watching the flames. Copper lay at their feet, his copper-colored fur warm against their legs. Outside, the wind howled through the frozen trees, but inside the cave, everything was warm and safe and full of the smell of bread. The winter of 1937 was the worst anyone could remember. It started in early December with a cold snap that drove the temperature below zero and kept it there for days. Then came the snow, feet of it, drifts piling up against houses, burying fences, making roads impassable. And then came the real cold. On the morning of January 15th, the temperature dropped to 35 degrees below zero. The air itself seemed to crystallize. Breath froze before it left your mouth. Spit crackled into ice before it hit the ground. Metal became so cold it could burn skin on contact. So cold it became brittle enough to snap. And it stayed that way for 9 days. In Copper Creek, the world fell apart. Livestock froze in the fields, their bodies stiff and strange against the white snow. Pipes burst. Water supplies turned to solid ice. Firewood ran out because no one had prepared for a cold this deep, this long, this deadly. People began to die. Old Mrs. Patterson, who had lived alone since her husband passed, was found frozen in her bed. The youngest Miller boy wandered away from his house during a moment when his mother's back was turned, and they found him the next day, less than 100 yards from the door. Dr. Phineas Ashworth could not leave his house to see patients. The cold was too dangerous. Anyone who went outside risked frostbite within minutes, death within hours. Brantley Hollis watched his remaining cattle die one by one. His ranch hands abandoned him, fleeing to wherever they thought might be safer. His wife Dorothea fell sick from the cold and could not get out of bed. The great rancher who had ruled Copper Creek for 30 years sat in his freezing house and understood that he was helpless. In the cave, everything was different. The limestone walls maintained their constant 55 degrees no matter how cold it got outside. The fire burned steadily, radiating heat that the stone absorbed and released slowly. The food stores were full. The water supply was protected from freezing by the cave's natural warmth. Opal stood at the entrance on the first morning of the deep freeze and looked out at a world that was trying to kill everything in it. "They'll come," she said to Wit. "They'll have to." And they came. The first arrivals were families from the mountain settlements, people who knew about the king, who had eaten Opal's bread and learned from her kitchen days. They came with children, bundled in every piece of clothing they owned, with whatever food they had managed to save, with fear in their eyes. Opal welcomed them in. By the third day, there were 35 people living in the cave. By the fifth day, there were 47. Opal organized everything. She rationed the food carefully, making sure there would be enough to last. She assigned sleeping areas and cooking shifts and water duty. She made sure children were fed first and elderly people were kept warm. Whit managed the fire and the water and the logistics. Cordelia helped with medical needs, treating frostbitten fingers and toes, watching for signs of illness. Zeke, still weak from his own sickness but unwilling to do nothing, told stories to keep people's spirits up. And Copper moved among the refugees like a therapy dog, allowing himself to be hugged by frightened children, lying beside sick people to keep them warm. One little girl, Emma Porter, was 5 years old. She had not spoken since her family's cabin collapsed under the weight of the snow. She sat silent and staring, wrapped in a blanket, refusing to eat. Copper went to her. He put his head in her lap and looked up at her with his brown eyes. For a long time, nothing happened. Then Emma's hand moved. She began to stroke Copper's severe, and she began to cry. She cried for a long time, and when she was done, she ate a bowl of soup, and she asked if she could sleep next to the dog. "Can I pet Copper again tomorrow?" she asked, her first words since the cabin fell. "You can pet him every day," Opal said. "Every single day." Lavinia Pickett came on the 6th day. She was the one who had told Hollis about Opal's cooking. She was the one who had spread the rumors about the children being thieves and witches. She had watched them walk out of town and had said, loud enough for everyone to hear, "Good riddance to bad rubbish." Now she stood at the cave entrance, shivering, her lips blue with cold. Her fine dress was torn. Her shoes were ruined. She had walked for hours through the snow because she had nowhere else to go. Opal recognized her immediately. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. Then Opal stepped aside and gestured toward the fire. "Come in," she said. "There is soup." Lavinia's eyes filled with tears. "I said terrible things about you," she whispered. "I told everyone you were thieves. I told everyone you were—" "I know what you said," Opal interrupted gently. "But right now you are cold and hungry. That is what matters." She led Lavinia to a spot by the fire and put a bowl of soup in her hands. Lavinia ate in silence, tears running down her cheeks. The temperature outside was 35 degrees below zero. Inside the cave, it was 55 degrees above. 47 people had crowded into the space, sharing food, sharing warmth, sharing hope. But there was still one person who had not come. The man who had thrown 2 children into the snow 3 years earlier. The man who had called them worthless and useless. The man who had tried to destroy everything they built. Here's a question worth considering. Do you think pride can survive a cold that kills cattle in the fields? Do you think hatred can keep you warm when your firewood is gone? Brantley Hollis had to make a choice. Come to the cave and admit he was wrong, or stay home and freeze. What do you think he chose? On the 8th day of the freeze, Brantley Hollis appeared at the edge of the clearing. He was 57 years old and he looked like a man who had aged a decade in a week. His face was gaunt. His clothes hung loose on a frame that had once been powerful. He held his hat in his hands, turning it around and around. He did not approach the cave. He just stood there at the edge of the trees, staring at the entrance, unable to move forward. Opal saw him through the steam rising from a pot of soup. She set down her spoon. She wiped her hands on her apron. She walked to the cave entrance. 47 pairs of eyes watched her, including Whit, whose face was dark with something that might have been rage, or might have been pain, or might have been both. "Don't," Wit said. "Don't let him in. After everything he did to us." "I know what he did," Opal said quietly. "He threw us out to die. He told everyone we were thieves. He tried to destroy everything we built." "I know," Opal said again. "He doesn't deserve our help." "I know." She stood there for a moment looking at the man who had caused them so much suffering, the man who had called them worthless, the man who had tried to turn the whole valley against them. Then she thought about her mother. Eleanor Mercer had fed anyone who was hungry. It had not mattered to her whether they were kind or cruel, whether they had been good to her or not. She had believed that food was love made visible and that love was not something you earned. It was something you gave. Take a moment to think about this. Opal could have refused. She could have turned him away. No one would have blamed her. After everything Hollis had done, after every lie he told, after every attempt to destroy them, she had every right to say no. But she did not. She walked out of the cave. The cold hit her like a physical blow, stealing her breath, biting into her skin. But she walked across the frozen ground to where Brantley Hollis stood. "Come inside," she said. "The soup is hot." Hollis stared at her. His lips moved, but no sound came out. "Your wife is sick," Opal said. "We can help her. Come inside." Slowly, like a man walking in a dream, Hollis followed her into the cave. The silence was absolute. 47 people watched as Brantley Hollis walked into the cave kitchen he had tried so hard to destroy. They watched as Opal led him to a spot near the fire. They watched as she handed him a bowl of soup and a piece of bread. Hollis sat down heavily. He looked at the soup in his hands. Steam rose from it, warming his frozen face. He did not eat. "I was wrong about you," he said. His voice was barely a whisper. "I was wrong about everything." Opal said nothing. "I told people you were thieves. I told them you were dangerous. I tried to make everyone hate you." Hollis looked up at her, and there were tears running down his weathered cheeks. "And you're feeding me." "Yes," Opal said simply. "I am." "Why?" Opal thought about the question. She thought about her mother, who had died trying to help sick neighbors. She thought about her father, who had taught illiterate strangers to read without asking for anything in return. "Because food is not just food," she said. "It's care, it's kindness. It's what we give to people who need it." She sat down across from him. "Eat your soup, Mr. Hollis. You need your strength. Then we'll go get your wife." Hollis ate. Oh boy. The soup was rich with vegetables and herbs, with the deep savory flavor of smoked meat and slow-cooked broth. It was the best thing he had ever tasted in his life. He ate it in the cave kitchen of the children he had thrown out to die, surrounded by the people who had been feeding half the county, while he sat in his big house and watched his cattle freeze. And something broke inside him. Not his pride, that had already been shattered by the cold. What broke was something harder. The wall he had built around his heart. The certainty that he was always right and everyone else was always wrong. When he finished the soup, he looked at Opal with new eyes. "Your mother," he said slowly. "She was Eleanor Mercer. I remember her now." Opal nodded. "She brought food to my wife once, years ago, when Dorothea was sick and I was away on business." Hollis shook his head. "I never thanked her. I never thanked anybody for anything." He stood up, his old bones creaking. "Help me get my wife," he said, "and then teach me. Teach me how you do this." They brought Dorothea Hollis to the cave that afternoon. She was desperately ill, weakened by cold and hunger, and something in her lungs that made every breath a struggle. Cordelia worked on her with the limited supplies she had. Opal made broths and teas. Zeke sat beside her bed and talked to her in his calm, steady voice. Dorothea opened her eyes on the second day and saw Opal sitting beside her, changing the compress on her forehead. Why, she whispered. "Why are you helping me?" Opal was quiet for a moment. "Because my mother would have helped you," she said finally. "And because being kind is not about whether someone deserves it. It is about who we choose to be." Dorothea began to cry. "I should have stopped him," she said. "When Brantley threw you out, I should have said something. I knew you hadn't stolen anything. I knew he was lying. But I said nothing. I just stood there and let him send 2 children out into the snow." "Shh," Opal said. "Rest now." There will be time for talking later. But there was something in Dorothea's eyes that had not been there before. Something that looked like the beginning of change. On the ninth day, the temperature finally rose above zero. The deep freeze was over. People began to emerge from the cave, blinking in the pale sunlight, staring at a world transformed. Trees had split open from the cold. Animals lay frozen in the fields. Houses had collapsed under the weight of ice and snow. But the people were alive. Opal stood at the cave entrance, watching them go. They hugged her before they left. They pressed her hands. They told her they would never forget. 47 people had sheltered in the cave kitchen during the worst cold snap in 50 years. Every single one of them survived. Spring came slowly that year. The snow melted into rivers of meltwater that carved new channels down the mountainside. The terraced gardens emerged from the white, battered but intact. The first green shoots of new growth appeared in the beds Opal had prepared the autumn before. And everything was different now. Word had spread through the valley about what happened during the freeze. About the cave kitchen. About the children who had fed and sheltered half the county. About the old man who told stories, and the young woman who healed the sick, and the copper-colored owl who comforted frightened children. People came to see for themselves. Not just the poor families from the mountain settlements, but people from Copper Creek itself. People who had listened to Hollis's lies. People who had called Opal and Wit thieves and witches and fools. They came and they saw the kitchen, and they ate the bread, and they understood how wrong they had been. Dr. Phineas Ashworth came. He walked around the cave for an hour examining everything. The food storage, the water filtration system, the constant temperature maintained by the limestone walls. "This is remarkable," he said finally, his voice grudging but honest. "The sanitation alone is better than half the kitchens in town. The preservation techniques are sound. The temperature regulation is—" He paused, searching for the word. "Ingenious." He looked at Opal. "I was wrong about folk medicine," he said. "I was wrong about a lot of things." He did not apologize directly, but he stopped speaking against the cave kitchen. And sometimes when Cordelia came to help with medical needs, he sent supplies along with her. Reverend Josiah Clement came. He stood in the cave while 40 people ate bread and listened to Zeke tell stories and watched children laugh and play with copper. "This is not pagan," he said slowly. "This is not witchcraft." He looked at Opal, who was teaching a young mother how to shape bread dough. "This is Christian charity," he said. "This is what the scripture tells us to do. Feed the hungry, shelter the stranger, clothe the naked. And I preached against it." He bowed his head. "Lord, forgive me." Cleet Tanner came. He walked in with his head down, unable to meet anyone's eyes. 2 fingers on his left hand were still bandaged from the frostbite he had suffered during the freeze. 2 fingers that would never bend properly again. "I owe you an apology," he said to Wit. "I said terrible things about you. I threw rocks at your dog. I bet money that you would die." Wit looked at him for a long moment. "Sit down," he said finally. "Have some soup, and then you can help us rebuild the lower terrace." Cleet blinked. "You want my help?" "I want everyone's help," Wit said. "That's how this works." Zeke Bowen died on a morning in early April 1938. He went peacefully in his sleep in the cabin he had called home for 30 years. He was 74 years old, and he had spent the last 4 years of his life teaching everything he knew to 2 children who had lost everything. Opal found him when she came to check on him that morning. He looked peaceful. He looked like he was still sleeping, like he might open his eyes at any moment and ask what she was making for breakfast. She sat beside his bed for a long time, holding his hand, crying quietly. Then she found the letter. It was tucked under his pillow, written in the careful script of a man who had learned to write late in life, each letter formed with deliberate concentration. "Wit," the letter began, "you are the brain that understands why things work. Opal, you are the heart that knows how to make things matter. Together, you are the finest cooks I have ever known in 55 years of cooking. Do not ever separate. Do not ever stop. What you have built is too important to let die." Opal read through her tears, her vision blurring. "There is one more thing you need to know. That debt your father supposedly owed to Brantley Hollis. $18 for fence posts. It was not real." Opal stopped reading. Her hands began to shake. I was there when your father bought those posts. I was the one who loaned him the money. Your father paid me back in full before he died. Every penny. Hollis knew this. He knew because I told him back when he first claimed you owed him a debt. He lied about it anyway. He took you as slaves for a debt that never existed. The letter continued. I did not tell you before because I wanted you to build what you have built for the right reasons. Not for revenge, not to prove a point, not to settle a score, but because it was right, because it was who you were, because your parents raised you to be people who help others. You proved your worth 100 times over. You do not need an old man's words to know what you are worth, but I wanted you to know the truth. You were never property. You were never in debt. You were always free. Remember me when you bake bread. I will be watching. Opal read the letter 3 times. Then she walked down the mountain to find her brother. Whit's face went through a dozen emotions as he read the letter. Shock, rage, grief, and finally something that looked almost like relief. He lied, Whit said. About everything. We were never supposed to be there at all. We were never his. We were always free. Yes, Opal agreed. Whit stood up. His hands were clenched. His jaw was tight. I want to show him this, he said. I want to make him admit what he did, in front of everyone. I want them all to know. Opal thought about it. She thought about confronting Hollis with the truth. She thought about the satisfaction of seeing him forced to admit his lies. Then she thought about her mother. What would Mama do? She asked quietly. Whit stopped. The anger drained out of him slowly, leaving something else behind, something that looked like peace. She would keep cooking, he said finally. She would let the food speak for her. Yes, Opal said, she would. They buried Zeke beside the creek, in a spot where the morning sun filtered through the trees. Half the county came to the funeral. Old Mamie Garretson spoke about the old ways that Zeke had helped keep alive. Reverend Clement said a prayer. Opal baked bread and served it to everyone who came. Brantley Hollis stood at the edge of the crowd, hat in his hands. When the service was over, Whit walked up to him. I know the truth, Whit said quietly, about the debt, about everything. Hollis went pale. His mouth opened, but no words came out. Zeke left a letter, Whit continued. He was there when our father bought those fence posts. He was the one who loaned him the money. You lied about everything. Hollis looked at the ground. He could not meet Whit's eyes. What are you going to do? He asked, his voice barely a whisper. Whit thought about all the things he could say, all the accusations he could make, all the justice he could demand. Then he thought about his sister, who had fed Hollis soup when he came begging, who had nursed Hollis's wife back to health, who had never asked for an apology or demanded an explanation. Nothing, Whit said. I'm not going to do anything. Hollis looked up, confused. My sister taught me something, Whit said. The best answer to cruelty is not revenge, it's creation. It's feeding people. It's building something that helps instead of hurts. He looked at Hollis steadily. You have to live with what you did. Every time you eat bread from our kitchen, you'll remember. Every time someone talks about the cave kitchen, you'll know the truth. He turned and walked away. Behind him, Brantley Hollis stood alone in the spring sunshine, tears running down his face. Sometimes the greatest punishment is simply living with the truth. Sometimes the deepest revenge is kindness. And sometimes the best way to win is not to fight at all. Think about that for a moment. Think about the people in your own life who have wronged you. Think about what it might mean to respond with creation instead of destruction. In the spring of 1940, Whit and Cordelia were married in the cave kitchen. 60 people packed into the space, spilling out through the entrance and onto the terrace. Both bread ovens were fired, and the smell of baking filled the air. Zeke's cast-iron skillet held cornbread made from Opal's recipe. The soapstone pots that the children had carved in their first desperate weeks held soup made from the garden's first spring vegetables. Reverend Clement performed the ceremony. Dr. Ashworth walked his daughter down the aisle. Old Mamie Garretson sat in a place of honor, wrapped in a quilt Opal had made for her. Copper, 15 years old now and moving slow, lay beside Opal's feet and watched the proceedings with patient brown eyes. I remember when you two walked out of the town, Cordelia said during the reception. I was 22 years old, and I watched from my window. 2 children and a barn walking into the mountains in November. Everyone said you would die. She looked around the cave at the faces of the people who had become their community. I thought so too, she continued. I'm so glad we were all wrong. Wit smiled and pulled her close. So am I, he said. The years passed. The cave kitchen grew. Wit built a dining hall at the entrance, a proper structure with a soaring stone fireplace and windows that looked out over the mountains. He built a teaching kitchen with 12 stations where Opal could train multiple people at once. He built storage buildings and guest cabins for people who traveled from far away to learn. But the cave itself remained the heart of everything. Its ancient stone walls were hung now with copper pots and dried herbs. The bread oven that Opal had built in 1935, with the help of an old riverboat cook named Zeke Bowen, still produced loaves that people swore were the best they had ever tasted. By 1945, when the war ended and soldiers came home to a changed world, the cave kitchen had become an institution. Opal was running what amounted to a free cooking school, a food bank, and a community center, all from a mountainside that everyone had once considered worthless. She trained over 200 people in food preservation, bread baking, and mountain gardening. Families who had been on the edge of starvation were now feeding themselves year-round using the techniques she had taught them. In 1950, Copper died. He was 16 years old, an extraordinary age for a dog his size. He passed peacefully in his sleep, lying in his favorite spot by the bread oven, surrounded by the smells of baking and herbs and everything he had loved. Opal buried him beside the oven, in a spot where he could watch over the kitchen forever. The headstone read, Copper, most faithful friend. He kept us warm when nothing else could. For weeks after his death, Opal found herself turning to say something to him, expecting to see his copper-colored fur in the corner of her eye. The cave felt emptier without him. But the work continued. It always continued. Brantley Hollis died in 1952. He was 73 years old, and he had spent the last 15 years of his life eating at the cave kitchen regularly. He never apologized publicly for what he had done. He never stood up in front of the town and admitted his lies. But he told people, quietly, whenever they asked, that the Mercer children were the finest cooks he had ever known and that he had been the greatest fool in the valley. And when he died, Opal went to his funeral. She brought bread. The 1950s brought recognition that Opal had never sought. The state of Tennessee gave her an award for community service. A newspaper in Nashville ran a feature story about her under the headline, The Cave Cook of Copper Ridge. People drove for hours to see the kitchen and taste the bread and meet the woman who had built something extraordinary from nothing. In the 1960s, a professor from the University of Tennessee came to study her terracing techniques and her methods of year-round food production in cold climates. He wrote a paper that was cited in agricultural journals for the next 20 years. In 1978, researchers from the University of Kentucky conducted a formal study of the cave itself. They installed temperature monitors and humidity sensors. They documented the fermentation processes Opal had been using for decades. Their findings confirm what Opal had known since she was 13 years old. The cave maintained a constant temperature of 54 to 56 degrees Fahrenheit year-round. The humidity levels were perfect for aging cheese and curing meat. The limestone walls naturally regulated moisture. This woman, the lead researcher wrote in his report, has been practicing techniques that modern food science is only beginning to understand. She learned them from her mother. Her mother learned them from generations before. Sometimes the old ways are not old at all. They are simply waiting for science to catch up. Modern scientists marveled at how she had used the cave's natural temperature regulation to create a perfect environment for fermenting, aging, and storing food. The same principles were now being incorporated into something called passive house design. The same techniques were being taught in university agricultural programs. Opal had discovered them in a cave when she was 13 years old, with nothing but 2 books in the memory of her mother's voice. In the 1970s, when the Back to the Land movement brought young people to Appalachia searching for a simpler way of life, the cave kitchen became a pilgrimage site. Idealistic college students came to learn practical skills from a woman who had been living them since before they were born. Through it all, Opal remained exactly who she had always been, a woman who believed that food was the most powerful force for good in the world, a woman who believed that a full table was the answer to nearly every problem, a woman who never turned anyone away never charged a penny, and never forgot what it felt like to be hungry. Witt died in 1975. He was 59 years old, taken by the same kind of illness that had almost killed Zeke all those years ago. Cordelia was with him at the end. So was Opal. "You did good, brother," Opal told him, holding his hand the way he had held hers on that frozen night in the mountains. "Mama and Papa would be proud." Witt smiled. "They'd be proudest of you," he said. "You were always the heart of everything." Those were his last words. Opal carried on alone after that. She had children and grandchildren now, a whole family that had grown up in the shadow of the mountain, learning to bake bread and tend gardens and feed anyone who walked through the door. But the heart of the kitchen was still hers. She baked bread every morning until she was 59 years old, when the arthritis in her hands finally made it too painful to knead dough. Even then, she sat in a chair by the oven and talked her granddaughter through every step. "Feel the dough," she would say. "It should feel like a baby's cheek, soft but with life in it. You'll know when it's right. Trust your hands." And her granddaughter would knead, and Opal would watch, and the tradition would continue. Opal Mercer died on a March morning in 1982. She passed in her sleep, in the cabin Witt had built beside the cave, in a room that looked out over the terraced gardens she had been tending for nearly 50 years. She was 61 years old. More than 300 people came to her funeral. They came from every hollow and valley in 3 counties. They came from cities hours away. They came because they had eaten her bread, because she had taught them to feed their families, because she had shown them that knowledge and kindness could change the world. Her daughter Ruth spoke at the service. "My mother was thrown out into the snow when she was 13 years old," Ruth said. "A man called her worthless. He said she couldn't cook. He said she would never amount to anything." Ruth looked around at the crowd that filled the clearing and spilled down the mountain. 300 people are here today because she proved him wrong, because she built something from nothing, because she fed everyone who was hungry and taught everyone who wanted to learn. Ruth's voice broke. She used to say that food is love made visible. That's what she gave to all of us. Love made visible. Every single day of her life. Today, the Cave Kitchen is maintained by a nonprofit organization that continues Opal's work. They teach mountain cooking and sustainable agriculture to a new generation. They preserve the techniques she developed and share them with anyone who wants to learn. The bread oven, the original one, the one Opal built from limestone blocks in 1935 with the help of an old steamboat cook named Zeke Bowen, still stands. They fire it up every Saturday. And they still use Opal's sourdough starter, which has been kept alive continuously for over 80 years. The same living culture that Opal began in her first year in the cave, feeding it and nurturing it and passing it on, generation after generation. People who taste the bread say there is something in it they cannot quite name, something warm and stubborn and alive, something that tastes like it was made by someone who refused to be broken. Here's what I think about when I think about Opal and Witt Mercer. I think about 2 children standing in a frozen yard with no coats and nothing to their names, being told they were worthless by a man who did not have a fraction of their talent or their courage. I think about how the very thing that got them cast out, their love of cooking, their desire to feed people, their refusal to make themselves small, was exactly what saved their lives and the lives of hundreds of others. I think about how the qualities that Copper Creek called flaws, the mountains called gifts, and I wonder, what are you carrying right now that someone has told you is worthless? What skill, what passion, what strange and stubborn part of yourself have you been told to hide, to shrink, to give up on? Maybe it is something creative that someone said was a waste of time. Maybe it is a way of seeing the world that others do not understand. Maybe it is a kindness that people have called weakness, or a dream that people have called foolish. Because if Opal's story teaches us anything, it is that the things that make us different are almost always the things that make us extraordinary. We just have to find the right place to let them grow. Every person who told Opal she could not cook, every person who said she was putting on airs, every person who looked the other way when she was cast into the cold. They were all wrong, and the proof was not in anything she said. It was in what she built. It was in the bread. It was always in the bread. Opal Mercer was thrown out with nothing. She built a kitchen in a cave, and from that kitchen, she fed a world. What could you build if you stopped listening to the people who told you it was impossible? If this story moved you, if it made you think about your own gifts and the people who tried to diminish them, hit subscribe for more stories about ordinary people who accomplished extraordinary things. And remember what Opal proved with every loaf of bread, every bowl of soup, every seed she planted on that cold mountainside. The best response to cruelty is not hatred, it is creation.